Hello, everyone. Brian with City of the Immaculata here, back with another edition of study tips for quick tips for studying history. I put these out every so often. I want it to be just a little primer for students of history. Some things that I wish that someone had told me, especially in the beginning phases of like really coming to know and love history. These will never be long videos. I'm going to try to like max myself here at like 10 to 15 minutes. So, um, first off, here's Chauncey Dog for you guys that have known him over the weeks and months of listening to this channel. He doesn't often make a appearance, but he's here with me today. Anyways, the impetus for today's discussion, I'm titling "Knowing the Limitations of Your Sources." And a couple things actually um, prompted me to have this live today. First one is I watched a debate last night with Trent Horn and Lila Rose against two YouTube streamers. I think that's like public or professional YouTube streamers. I'm not quite for sure what they do for a living, but anyways, very. I God bless Horn and Rose both for sitting through that. I had a hard time watching it. For one thing, just the topic matter was very. Um, it's not the kind of thing I want to spend my afternoons thinking about. And as well, the um, Trent Horn and Lila Rose were obviously representing the Catholic side. The other side was the secular side, and the debate. Question was whether or not pornography is bad for society. And anyways, there was on the opposite side, representing the secularist view, was a very let's inappropriately dressed woman who I feel may have done that either for reasons of insecurity or really just because she's a vile human being, especially given the nature of who her interlocutors were in the discussion that they would be having. But anyway, she kept employing this tactic that I see so often with secularists, where the only thing that she would accept was evidence from studies. You know, it was always about studies, studies, studies. And I just want to like say here, I want to go into a little bit for those of you who are kind of having to jump, especially right into the university level with some of these things. You don't necessarily get good primers and say meta analysis of certain um, limitations that you have and how we can accept certain sources with what degrees of certainty and certitude can we draw from these, especially as it relates to history and the social sciences, because the big problem with your academic research is replication. You can give me like a certain STEM subject, right? And if you run it through the course of peer-reviewed journals, I mean, if it comes to, let's say, an inaccurate way of engineering a bridge, we can repeat that with a certain degree of replication, where it says if enough people, you know, if enough of your peers come together and say that bridge is going to collapse, you have a high degree of certainty that that bridge is going to collapse. Where with history, for one thing, in history, the events are past, so we can't replicate them. We have to rely on certain sources and what those sources tell us, as well in the social sciences, which is the general gist of the debate that they were having yesterday. Replication of these studies is extremely difficult, and if you're going to accept the box of evidence that the secularist tells you that's all that they're going to accept, then you have to at least be aware of the limitations that they are placing on themselves, right? And the first source I want to bring to your attention is the limitations of primary sources with something like history, because you know, right now I'm actually working on something for you guys. I'm working on a little thing I'm going to put together about. Um, I'm doing a series of talks. I've been doing a series of talks on the Middle Ages, and the next one that I'm doing is going to be on marriage and gender roles. And I'm reading a medieval source on gender roles. And as I'm reading through it, it becomes kind of clear to me that the person who's writing this specific source that I'm reading has a very, I want to say it's an idiosyncratic view of the female sex that I don't think is necessarily representative of what society around what the female interactions around him actually would have been like real time on the ground for another human being. I think we're actually, when you read this source, and this is a source that historians will turn to as a primary source because he is writing of the times, but it's like, okay, is this actually accurate representation of how women were, or is this the lens at which this guy is looking at the world through? And you have to really be careful when it comes. Look, I'm not knocking primary sources. I think primary sources are great. They have their place. But again, you have to step back and look at it. And we don't often have the vantage point of looking down on who it is that we're getting our sources from, right? So we're lucky with the few sources. Like I could take like Bede's History of the English Speaking People. I can say some things about Saint Venerable Bede, which gives me a degree of certainty and how I'm going to read his source as a primary source, because he did have certain, let's say, idiosyncratic views um, on the Anglo-Saxons, as well as he had certain views on the papacy. Um, so when I go to approach Bede, I have to be aware of who it is, the person that's actually writing as a primary source. The second thing I want to speak to is this whole thing of peer review in these studies. This, like what this woman kept bringing up yesterday, the studies. But there's a lot you can say about this. And again, just like with primary sources, I'm not against peer review. It has its place, but you absolutely have to be aware of the limitations of academic research. And I'll just give you a prime example of this, right? A case in point. If you want to, as a Catholic or as a Christian or as a secularist, as just a demographer, if you want to study Christianity in Africa, maybe this has changed within the last 10 years. I haven't looked at this in the last 10 years, but as of 10 years ago, almost all of the academic research about Christianity in Africa was overwhelmingly dedicated to the independent African churches, which is a wide swath of, like, from semi-orthodox all the way to the most extreme, like, wild beliefs that you could associate, certain syncretistic practices that might take place in an independent church. The problem with that is that the independent churches themselves in Africa have always been a smaller minority. The overwhelming majority of Christians in Africa are Catholics, and the overwhelming majority of those are very Orthodox Catholics. So when you go to read these papers, these peer-reviewed papers on the church in Africa, the implication is that the African church tends to look much more exotic than what it actually really is. One, and this is why I'm actually really I saw a few times in the debate yesterday with Trent and Lila where they were trying to steer towards a more meta-analysis, but the interlocutors, the secularists on the other side of the table, weren't having that at all, because their whole foundation really rests on exceeding the limits of this, like, myopic view that constitutes what they would accept as evidence. But the reality is, when you go to study something like the church in Africa, the bias of the academia has always been that Africa is a very foreign, exotic place. In academia, Western academia wants to look at Africa as a foreign, exotic place. So it will hyper focus on these independent churches, even though those independent churches aren't actually representative of the church as a whole in Africa. So if I'm constantly, like, turning in the social sciences to these to the studies, you actually really aren't doing a great service. Now, I get this is a debate, right? So there's a high degree of rhetoric involved, And it's not necessarily about getting into um, I hate to even say the, but yeah, I guess the weeds. It's not about getting into the weeds, but the reality is, I think before you even sit down with the person like this, if you're going to have that kind of debate, you almost have to have like a similar epistemological foundation laid out, because otherwise it's just like they're like throwing stones at each other back and forth. And the debate to me really wasn't all that productive. I feel like Trent and Lila were trying to steer it in a certain meta way, but the other people just weren't accepting it because they had this way of what they wanted to see um, evidence. Their idea of evidence was very limited in scope. And if you're going to sit down with somebody, you have to be aware of what they are accepting as evidence, which might be beyond what actually I would say constitutes as evidence if we're being sincere in our research. Um, I think we need to actually kind of completely unrelated to the debate yesterday. I would say that we need to have a greater emphasis placed on ourselves if we're going to be having these kinds of discussions about what actually does constitute evidence and certitude and certainty. And this is a area of interest for me recently. I have given some consideration. I actually grabbed it off the shelf just to show you guys. Newman's Grammar of Assent, I think, is a good place to start if you guys are interested in um, a philosophical approach to how we can sort of justify certain beliefs, because these people, man, these secularists, and I saw it in these two people yesterday, they have a very like their whole house is built on this card of and very limited evidence, and it's honestly not a very stable structure that they're basing their entire premises on, because the limitations again of the sources that we're using, we're all up against the same challenges, right? So when they're saying something yesterday about like whether or not pornography is good for society, I feel like we have to have a much wider projection of what that even means and whether or not these so-called studies, I'm not saying there's not a place for the studies, and I'm not saying they can't be helpful in a way, but to come in and act like that's the only way to present history or the social sciences and to make sort of judgments that we can say something like, yeah, I can draw back on what I know from history about whether or not certain sexual license is good for society or not, without actually having academic resources on standby to sort of back me up. Anyways, guys, we're coming up at 13 minutes. The main point of this is really just always be aware of the sources that you're using and aware of what their limitations are, right? Because I feel like if you know the boundaries and the limitations of sources, you have a much wider um, field view to work with when you're aware of like, oh, okay, so that's the boundary, that's a boundary, and when you're working within those boundaries, you can rest with a higher degree of certainty, or you can at least be aware that your degrees of certainty isn't very good. Hopefully, all that makes sense, guys. God bless and take care.